So that this led to a fourth external reason undermining a provisional government, which was unrest in the urban environment. That urban workers were disgruntled because they were not getting the food supplies that they thought they deserved. The urban environment is the environment, particularly Petrograd, in which any government is going to have to operate and any government is going to rise and fall. Petrograd is unique at this time. It's unique in its politics. It is the most radical element of Russia. It is also the environment in which any national congress, whether it be meetings of workers, peasants, soldiers, industrialists, educationalists, religious organisations, whatever it might be, they all meet in the capital. So in the capital over these months of 1917, we see a tremendous concentration of political forces, political debate, and political discontent. So a government that's trying to operate in this environment is pressurised from all sides politically. Now, if I could turn back the clock and give one piece of advice to the Russian Provisional Government, it would have been to have moved the seat of government from Petrograd to Moscow. Moscow was incredibly more conservative with a small c politically. It's where the social base of the Moscow industrialists was at its strongest, and where the revolutionary parties were at their most moderate. So if we compare Moscow Bolsheviks with Petrograd Bolsheviks in 1917, the big difference that we see is that Moscow Bolsheviks are for a coalition government, whereas Petrograd Bolsheviks are for single socialist governmental rule. So the capital is quite a bizarre place to be in 1917. It's something that is quite accidental, and it's outside the control of the provisional government, and it is undoubtedly a reason that undermines the provisional government's authority. This leads into a fifth reason that's external to the provisional government, which is the formation of Soviets. Soviets, the institutions of the 1905 revolution that re-emerged in 1917, institutions of popular democratic control, elected from below by soldiers and sailors and peasants. Now, if you were to be given the task in March 1917 of controlling a transition in Russia from the Tsar that had ruled for several centuries to a popular elected democratic constituent assembly, the last thing that you would want would be for a competitor in power in the capital. And this is precisely what the Soviet was. And I think in these months in 1917, the Soviet plays a far from honourable role. Because on the one hand, it is willing to say, yes, we will enable the provisional government to govern, and we will allow it to have executive authority and the responsibility that goes along with that. But at the same time, it undermined the authority of the provisional government by passing its own legislation in incredibly key areas of government. The key area that's absolutely vital is the army. And the Soviet passes laws about the democratization of the army that takes power away from the generals and passes it into the hands of the soldiers. The Soviet insists that it is going to control the movement of troops in and out of the capital. Now, how can a government govern when it has no control over the armed forces of the state? So the provisional government, for no reason of its own, is undermined by this external force in this incredibly turbulent situation in the capital. Added on to that, a final reason external to the provisional government is the movement within the Bolshevik party in Petrograd in 1917. The victory of the Leninist wing within the Bolshevik party, which turns itself into the only political force in Russia which is willing to go for single-party rule against the provisional government. Again, something outside the control of the provisional government. So when you add all these factors together, what's remarkable in a sense is actually how long the provisional government managed to survive, rather than why did it fail. Let me move on to reasons internal to the provisional government. I think here I would highlight two. Both are different aspects of leadership in this provisional government. One is the role of political parties. Political parties are still very much in a process of formation in Russia in 1917. But there was not one single political party that was willing to give the provisional government the necessary unity, the necessary ballast to survive throughout the turmoil of 1917. Political parties all too quickly were willing to abandon the provisional government. So that what we really need to talk about is not a provisional government, but successive provisional governments. Because there was a constant process of political realignment, a constant process of change in the cabinet as political parties came and went in the provisional government. The easiest thing to do in politics, in a sense, is to resign. And yet this undermines continually the provisional government. So that what we are left with post-July is largely control of one individual, Kerensky. So the social base of this government, from this broad-based national government of unity in the spring of 1917, by the summer of 1917, becomes rule associated with one man. And what a man, Kerensky. Russian politics is incredibly machismo. It's incredibly patriarchal. It's male-dominated. We see this right into the present period. President Putin, for example, who proved his manlyhood by stripping down to his underpants and diving into icy waters and being a martial arts expert and this sort of thing. Well, in 1917, Kerensky was seen as predominantly effeminate. He was seen as that worst of creatures, a woman. He was seen as politically weak and ineffectual. So the leadership of the provisional government in the figure of Kerensky was largely ridiculed in the politics of 1917. And Kerensky then added to this by making one tremendous political bungle. And that was the alliance with Kornilov. General Kornilov. Kornilov was an authoritarian. He was somebody who believed in the restoration of order in the capital. Together with Kerensky, they came up with a plot to move Kornilov's forces into the capital, to close the Soviet, to rule by martial law, to finally assert some authority for this government. Now, one can argue that that should have been the strategy from February, that this was the correct strategy to pursue. But what happened was the Kornilov revolt failed because Kerensky lost his nerve. That at a certain point, Kerensky was more worried that Kornilov was going to establish himself as a dictator and bypass Kerensky's leadership. So Kerensky turned to the Soviet for help. And the Soviet formed its own forces. Along with the railway workers, it prevented the movement of Kornilov's forces into the capital, and therefore the Kornilov rebellion failed. So who was the real winner of the Kornilov rebellion? It was not the provisional government, whose authority was now completely in tatters. We really have to talk about the end of the provisional government from this point. The real winner was the Petrograd Soviet, whose forces had effectively mobilized to defend Petrograd, and all of the Bolsheviks who were allowed out of prison. Leon Trotsky, Lunacharsky. And the lesson these Bolsheviks learned from the failure of the Kornilov rebellion was that the biggest threat to a successful revolution at this time would be a movement of troops outside the capital, inside the capital. So what Trotsky learned from that was that he had to put all of the Soviets' forces across the northern region around Petrograd together. And he used the Congress of the Soviets of the northern region to do this, in this way throwing a defensive ring around the capital, and once this defensive ring was in place, then the Bolsheviks could seize power peaceably within Petrograd. And that was precisely what happened. So the big winner of the failure of the Kornilov revolt was the Soviet and specifically the Bolsheviks. The big loser was the Provisional Government, and this really comes down to a failure of leadership by Kerensky. So yes, there were very large and consequential political mistakes by the leadership, but at the same time I would argue that it was really the much broader environment, all of these reasons external to the Provisional Government, that meant it would be very difficult for a liberal democratic regime to take root in Russia in 1917. Having said that, I'd like to conclude this talk with a mention of one very significant success of the Provisional Government. And that is, we must remember that the Provisional Government was provisional. It was a temporary administration. It was intended from the very outset to be a bridge from Tsarism to a functioning democracy. And what that meant was the organisation of free and fair elections in Russia for the election of a constituent assembly. Now, those of us who have lived in this historical period, who've lived through political change in Iraq and Afghanistan through war, understand full well the difficulties of establishing pluralist democracies in conditions of military conflict. Once we understand the enormous task of this, the organisation of 100 million plus electors through an electoral process, then we can say what a remarkable achievement of the Provisional Government to arrange those elections by the November of 1917. And when the Bolsheviks took power in October 1917, they were incredibly worried by these elections. The Bolsheviks thought, how long will we be able to stay in power after these elections? Will the legitimacy of these elections not outweigh the legitimacy of our seizure of power? So they discussed within the Bolshevik Central Committee the possibility of cancelling the elections. And they thought, heavens, we can't do that because the popular will be against us. In January 1918, this democratically elected Constituent Assembly actually met. And this is a great success of the Provisional Government, that it actually managed to achieve what it set out to achieve in the incredibly difficult turmoil of 1917. This Constituent Assembly had to be shut down by force, and that signalled the ultimate failure of the Provisional Government, not for any reason of its own, but for every reason coming externally from the Bolsheviks. That was the tragedy of the Provisional Government, and one could argue, given subsequent events, that that was also a tragedy for Russia.